exercise. I went on a journey where I was trying to articulate my perception of the power in light, and that led to my kind of working through 10 books. And just the I think the process of working through them was, itself like an initiation into the whole body of light at a deeper and deeper level. And I've got to say that it still remains quite a mystery to me, even after spending a couple of decades on trying to understand it. um, but I think the more time that I spend on it to just try and grapple with what it is and how it's applicable and how it materializes itself, the more I feel like it's a worthwhile path to kind of tread down. And whenever simple things like when I write just a simple blog, also there's just like a little more clarity that surfaces for me. So that's the interesting part. It's just like, I think, just trying to connect uh, many different areas and how they relate to light, then I begin to see things a little more clearly. And so that's what I wanted to share. And I'd be curious if, as we go through some of these musings, if a similar thing happens for you, or whether it's helpful or not. I try to totally change the language and the way I present it, and also put in some pictures and things, and to try and capture the concept in different ways than just in words. But so I'm curious, and I love your kind of frank impressions as we go through these. So I'm going to share the screen here, and we can look at the first one. And does that does that show up the index? Okay, awesome.
Yep.
Okay, great. And so I'm a little bit about this index. So what I tried to do here was just capture all the different the breadth of different writings, the academic writings, the self-published writings, and just different aspects of my journey into light in one place. So the first part is just a contextual cosmology of light post section. And here I've got an overview of, for example, like the 6-book series, and then um, an overview of the 4 applications in cosmology of light, and then a TEDx talk that I gave recently. And just if anyone's interested, I've been involved in academic writings for about 20 years, all related to the subject of light, in the sense that they all dovetail into this cosmology of light in different places. So, and then I also did a mini series for Forbes on light, which I held probably around, in the corporate space, also about 30, 40 different workshops. So it's just tries to capture everything that I've been involved with in this journey of light. So that's the background of it. And one interesting thing that I'll also mention is that um, I've been working on a patent as well for a quantum computer based on the framework of light that I've um, been focusing on for the last 10 years or so. And it occurred to me that there's, because of the mathematics that I've been working with, that it's possible to actually put a concrete kind of invention in place. So that's what I've spent the last couple of months doing, and it's a long process. So uh, the patent is in process of being filed right now. But with that, I'm going to switch to the first musing, which is just light's native state. And from going through the workshops, this will be familiar to you. But let me just pause and, as you went through it, I'm curious, what your reflections are, or whether it surfaced any thoughts for you, and so on. So I'm going to pause and just turn it over to you.
When you initially introduced uh, some of these concepts, I was sort of guarded because I was still more heavily ingrained within a more strictly materialism, scientific, three-dimensional paradigm, um, and trying to sort of mesh the perspective with what my belief systems were at the time was really difficult, and there were barriers to that. But since then, I've been exposed to some other models and concepts that sort of become more inclusive, and I can see a lot more how this fits into some of those models, and I can sort of use it to inform in a different way some of the thoughts and concepts I have about the greater structure of our universe beyond um, our our three-dimensional experience.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, yeah. What one thing I try to do in these, especially in this initial post, was just lay out the structure that runs through materialization, in a sense. So what I'm suggesting here is that the organizational principles that are responsible for the way matter and life arise actually exist in light itself. And what I was trying to tease out through this thought experiment, if you will, is just these four properties of light, which we can call them roughly, omnipresence, omnipotence, omniscience, and omninurturing. But they have different names, as we begin to, try to relate them to practical things. So.
Ravi, in your talks, I'd really like if you can bring some thing about the shadow aspect of light, because as we experience the world, wherever there is light, there is shadow. And since you say that the light would consume everything, kind of as I get it, like, so there is a sense of omnipresence and everything. And also you bring in the concept of nurturing with the concept of light. So how about the shadow aspects, because a shadow falls when there is light, and so does the nurturing aspect, and the omnipresence and omniscience also percolate into that shadow aspect. And if it percolates, then why do we not experience that aspect of it in the shadow,
Yeah,
our reality experience?
yeah, that's a really, I think, important thing to think about. And the way that I think about it in this cosmology of light framework is that, if so light can project itself at different speeds. So here, in this musing, we're saying that light in its native state exists infinitely fast. And so there's infinite potential at when it's traveling infinitely fast. And due to that infinite potential, it can project itself at other speeds. And one speed that we're familiar with is the 186,000 miles per second, which is uh, known as the constant speed of light in our physical universe. But if we think about light projecting itself also at zero speed, for instance, so, you imagine a world that's created. So the hypothesis, or the main kind of thought behind this idea of light creating a cosmology, is that there is some kind of phenomena or device by which light can create different realities, if you will. And that phenomena, we can understand it by thinking about light at different speeds. So if light were to travel or project itself at zero speed, then if you were imagine that reality it would create, light would not be able to travel anywhere. So you would experience just darkness. And so, these four aspects of like omnipresence, omnipotence, omniscience, omninurturing, in a sense, get swallowed up or they get hidden inside this thing that occurs or appears as complete darkness simply because, light cannot express itself. And so the reality that you might experience or that might be created at that level is the opposite of in fact this thing of, rather than being omnipresence, there's an absence of light, means there's complete darkness. Rather than being the potence, since light can't do anything in that reality, it's kind of like covered up in itself. So there's a complete weakness. There's complete ignorance because, again, light cannot, what we're saying is that when light travels infinitely fast, that because of its fabric existing in whatever volume, it can sense, it can all appearances, disappearances. But if light is swallowed up in itself in this zero projection, then it's the opposite. There's complete ignorance, and similarly, there is complete disharmony because nothing is being connected by anything. So, when we think about the shadow side, one way I would think about it is that these different kinds of realities that light can create, all exist simultaneously. And so the shadow exists simultaneously along with everything that is being suggested in this initial musing, where light's in its native state traveling infinitely fast. And the thing is that, us as beings having choice, as beings that can, in a sense, contact different layers of light if we choose to, there's already this influence of this layer of light automatically where it's projected at zero speed. And therefore, there's this dark influence that always exists that wants to keep us, in a sense, like swallowed up in smallness, as smallness, without being able to experience anything larger. But also there's the influence of this layer of light that travels infinitely fast simultaneously. And so it becomes a process, by which, in a sense, we have to make choices and kind of do the work to disengage more and more from that shadow side and from the darkness that exists, and choose the light and kind of choose to, for example, experience ourselves broader and in a different kind of way. So it's a process, but that's how I think about the notion of this shadow that's being created simultaneously, if you will.
That's nice. To me, how it looks like, what I get from what you say is like, would it be something like that when we experience the light as shadow outside ourselves, then because of the omnipresent nature of light, we ignite the light within us. And therefore, through that light, we choose to dispel the shadow.
Yeah, I think certainly in terms of process, that would be a way in which that shadow can be dispelled. Yeah, um, that makes sense to me. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
I could also see from a sort of spiritual perspective that as soon as you downstep from infinite the infinite speed of light, as soon as you step down from an all oneness and you have some kind of, and light creates some kind of individuation, is when you start to create shadow. That at that level there is no shadow, and then there's like, as soon as you step down from that all oneness, you begin to create shadow. And in a sense too, and this fits in with some things that I've experienced over the last year, we often in many spiritual teachings, it is like it's almost like, yeah, we're meant to just dispel the shadow, bring more light, like, and but I think that shadow is, it's also important to keep in mind that that's a part of our existence. As we've downstepped, there is that shadow that's created, and we we don't, so on one hand you can look at like the then no speed and there's a shadow at the bottom, and we're trying to like work our way up towards this oneness. But on another hand, you can look at it as light is creating all of these aspects of reality, the light and the shadow. The shadow is still a part of us in a sense. And if you think of us as not just this form of us, but an an us that can exist all the way up to that oneness, that we almost have to integrate that shadow, like examine and integrate that shadow to be able to, get back to that uh, state of oneness again.
Yeah.
That's a bit of a divergence, but
No, I don't think it's
No,
a.
I get it. Yeah, for me, integration of the shadow is also shining the power of light in that shadow. So that is when it gets integrated, because it's so important for us to acknowledge the different aspects in us. And if we kind of abandon them, then the shadow remains, because it's like wherever there is shadow, you're running away. But if you want to dispel the shadow, the only way to integrate the shadow is to shine a torch there, and then the shadow gets dispelled. So for me, that's how the integration process looks like.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that the language that I've tended to use in these series of blogs, in the next musing or in the third musing that we will touch on, there is this notion of quantization, and we can speak about that. But any act of quantization essentially begins to differentiate what's one in light into different aspects. And when that differentiation takes place, then that materialization that comes into being, just automatically would create a shadow, because it's now separate from the oneness that is light. That doesn't mean that it can't become one with light, but it's just naturally that quantization will create a separateness that will create a shadow, and then it becomes a process by which we need to reintegrate things. So
I have a question that's sort of related to quantization.
yeah.
Have you given any thought to, so within this cosmology, it it's presented as light being the building block of everything. So I guess there's a couple of questions here.
Yeah.
Is that within a paradigm where that light is still carried by a photon and a wave in the sense that we know it now, but just at a level where it has infinite speed? Or is this more, can this be more metaphorical for some substance, some pre-light substance that maybe we don't quite have an understanding of? And then how does this take into account space? What is, does space exist at that level? Because there's also in some modern theories where we've tried to uh, find agreement between relativity and quantum mechanics. There's things like loop quantum gravity, where in the math they've quantized space at the Planck scale, and it kind of dissolves some of those issues.
Yeah.
So yeah, is it a photon? Is it some kind of pre-light substance? What is the nature of space
Yeah.
within the cosmology?
Yeah. So actually, Scott, in the subsequent musings, exactly what you brought up is what I begin to address, and we'll reach these. So if we continue this on a weekly basis. Then by month 2 or 3, we'll get into that. But exactly what you're referring to. First of all, the foundation here is light. So it's saying that light is the basic building block, but not light as we perceive it. Photon itself is a materialization of light within. So it's a quantized. It's a packet of light that occurs when light's traveling at 186,000 miles per second. So it has a specific um, meaning within this whole framework of light. But when we speak about space, time, energy, gravity, um, in my perception, these are all emergent from light, and we'll go through why. So even the notion of, like you referred to, quantum loop gravity, and where space is quantized, that's completely consistent with this framework that I've put together. When we view light as being the foundation, and then light projecting itself into other layers of light, and in that projection, there's, if I were to use a mathematical phenomena or metaphor, there's symmetry that exists. So what I mean to say is that, if we go back to this notion of these four properties that we're saying exist when light exists in its native state of traveling infinitely fast, there's four properties, but that symmetry persists no matter how light projects itself. So when light occurs at 186,000 miles per second, then one of the first symmetries we see is this fourfoldness of space-time, energy, gravity. And it's related to this notion of omniscience, omnipotence, omniharmony, and omnipresence. And there's a one-to-one mapping in a sense. So space or time or energy or gravity is a view into that same thing that exists when light's traveling infinitely fast, except it's filtered in this layer where light is traveling at 186,000 miles per second in a particular way. And we'll go through the logic of why that filter exists, and how it's still relating to the same concept behind. So these are really fundamental questions to this whole thing of cosmology of light. And if I were to just sweep through, so you can see some of the areas that I've covered here, so for example, the notion of quanta, Big Bang, we get into emergence of time and matter. Then also why Einstein's theory of relativity kind of emerges from this, the whole notion of moving from unity to diversity, the materialization of light. We're familiar with this notion of wave particle duality, but I want to propose that there's actually a fourfold quadrality, a block field wave particle quadrality. Then we get into alternative notions of quantum computation that I'm proposing in cosmology of light are just fundamental to how the universe expresses itself from moment to moment, because there's this persistent quantum computation that's taking place. And why quantum computation? Because quanta is a bridge mechanism between one layer of light and another layer of light. And so there's this arbitration that takes place when information from one layer materializes in another layer. And that's the way that we can think about quantum computation in a different way. What's entanglement and superposition and annealing and tunneling, these properties that we see in quantum computation. How should we think about space-time, energy, gravity? And then when you get into the structure of the electromagnetic spectrum, and so what does a photon stand for? You get into what are quantum particles. You get into, for example, um, the different bosons, photon, gluon, W and Z boson, graviton. What do they mean in this framework? And similarly, what are at the molecular level nucleic acids, polysaccharides, lipids, proteins, which are all related to this fourfoldness. So there's a symmetry that we continue to see, where we get a different view based on how we're looking at things, but it's still the same thing. And then also we get into expansion and contraction dynamics of the cosmos that I relate to some fundamental phenomena in cosmology of light. and then getting into, once the human being arises in this complexity of things, then what does choice and power really mean? And then you may have heard the term complex adaptive systems, which has become like it's a more contemporary emergence of systems thinking, but looking particularly at systems that are known to be most resilient. So, what are the properties of those systems, and how do they relate to the structure of light? And then also culture, nations. So, this the whole idea is that this is a cosmology, and in a cosmology, we should be able to shed insight into any phenomena that arises in the cosmos. When we use light as the basis to understand or create a cosmology. And so that's kind of the trend of these topics here. So they become, more and more um, large. For example, what are the conditions for world peace from the point of view of thinking about this fourfoldness of light. And then, I did want to address, and this is where I'm at right now in this series, is, when we think about mathematical concepts that have arisen, or um, well, basic equations that arise in when we think about quantum physics, how should we rethink about those based on a cosmology of light? So that's where I'm at right now. So just, reinterpreting things like Schrodinger's wave equation, which is fundamental to quantum physics, and then I'm going to go into Euler's identity, and then also going to Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, and look at some of the work that Feynman did, also from the point of view of light. So, the idea is, again, to just create a very broad sweep in simple languages that reinforce this idea that if we just think about light, we can in fact construct a whole cosmology in which there's an explanation for many different phenomena that we experience, and they're all related. They're not separate. So that's kind of the sweep of what we'll be going through. And so, we consider light's native state. Let me move to the second musing here, which is the basis of existence. I'm not sure if you had any thoughts, but I'm going to pause for a sec, take any thoughts, and then I'll just share the main thrust of this.
Would you be sharing more on that concept of light and the creating of space,
Yeah,
gravity, and everything? Okay.
absolutely. And we reached, I want to go through this just sequentially,
Okay.
but the idea is that, when we meet, we discuss, like, 3 or 5 of these musings, and so we'll get to the space time in a few weeks. Then, like, it'll be like week 3 or 4. But in order to understand space time, energy, gravity, it's better to have this as a background. So it's I've tried to keep this sequential thread as we go through these musings, so that one thing builds on another.
And
We're jumping ahead.
Yeah, no, but it's important. I mean, it's good to kind of get the scope of this, and yeah, go ahead, go.
And do you have anything about the relation of light and sound, especially with the consideration of Om as the universal sound, and it also has those healing properties? So, is there any parts where you relate that universal sound energy with the concept of light as omnipresence and omni healer?
Uh, yes, yeah, and I probably do need to write something a little more specific, but I let me go back to the link here, and the areas where the notion of sound begins to, where I address it, is um, when I think about, for example, significance of number, and this notion of cycles of time. So there's some reference to sound over there. and the relation between light and sound. But we'll come to that as well. Yeah.
Yes, because what was coming to me was like, because sound travels in waves, and when light travels, is there a point where there is that universal healing? Is there a point that that speed, because light can travel at different speed, that speed can coincide, and then the effects of both can manifest?
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, that's a very good thought. Um,
That's I just want to, on the topic of sound, the sound comes about in a lot of spiritual teachings, and even some of these like spiritual science models that I've looked into, and it was really tricky for me, light and sound in particular, because when we're talking about light here, most of the time we're not talking about the light that we're familiar with. That's a downstepping, a manifestation of a particular perspective of light. Sound, too, our sound, that what we know sound as is uh vibrations in air. It needs like a physical medium to manifest in the way that we know sound, and it's piezoelectric in our ears and whatnot. So it's interesting. Sound is a really interesting metaphor too, of how to think about things from a more cosmic perspective, and trying to understand what sound actually is at that higher level too, in the way that we're looking at what's the difference between a photon and our broader concept of light. So I think sound's really interesting in that sense. And some things that come up when I think about sound at a more fundamental level are like scalar wave structures. I wonder if that's come up for you at all in thinking about light as it relates to scalar fields.
no, I haven't particularly thought about it, though. I think that's a good cue. I should think about that a little bit, read up on it, and see how it can make connection. Yeah, cool. Yeah. Um, so let me, just come to the second musing here. Did you have in going through this, if you recall, do you have any comments, and then I can just give the main thrust of this.
It would be nice if you summarize that a bit,
Sure.
because I think we just have the link for the first musing, or
Okay,
maybe.
no problem. Yeah, sure, sure. Yeah, and just, by the way, so at the bottom of every musing, there's a link to all the musings, so you should be able to navigate through pretty easily. But let me share the thrust of this. So the idea here is that, in the first musing, we're suggesting that when light travels infinitely fast, that there's these four properties: this all presence, all power, all harmony, all knowledge, that are fundamental to it. And these four things exist in a sense, as an integral reality simultaneously. So they're one thing. So there's an implicit oneness that animates this expression of fourness, and that's the basis of love. And so when light projects itself at slower and slower speed, these four things, as they begin to separate, and we'll see how they separate into different materialized aspects, for example, like space-time, energy, gravity, there's an impulsion for it to still operate as one, and that impulsion is nothing other than love in this framework. So the idea is that love is very fundamental, or is kind of like the secret of light, if you will, or is just integral, or is inside light, in this point of view. So that's all this is kind of drawing attention to, that as this separation begins to take place, this materialization due to light traveling slower and slower, and these four things separate, yet as we'll see very concretely how these four still want to embrace each other and operate as one. So for example, all quantum particles all kinds of the four kinds of quantum particles, bosons, Higgs boson, quarks, leptons, are all required to create an atom. So there's this kind of embrace where they hold each other in unity, and that creates the atom, which in a sense then becomes an expression of love. Or even at the cellular level, we know that there are four molecular plans that are required for a living cell to exist, and that's the lipids, proteins, nucleic acids, and polysaccharides. And so again, it's that fourfoldness embracing itself to create a foundation on which creation can exist at that level, and that is nothing other than love again. So we see concrete manifestation of love, and the point being that this love is implicit in the nature of light, in that fourfoldness that is one. And then as it becomes explicit, as the materialization occurs, it when we see this embracing of things, it's due to this dynamic of wanting to hold its unity together, which is love. So
I appreciate this a lot, and I like that it's early on, because this is one of the more practical um, and beautiful aspects of the the perspective, and kind of carries over into many different thought uh, um, uh, many different kinds of thought that exist in some of the spiritual teachings that I've come across. It reminds me of the like this top level reminds me of the concept of source, where we almost have like a direct line up back to source, and that's where like infinite love exists, and we can always tap into that. um so that's like, and it's hard to, like, we're going through a process in our lives to connect back to that, and remember that, and remember the infinite love that we always have access to, but we often forget about because of our experience. So I like that a lot.
that's very well said. Thank you.
For me, what's occurring is like, what's the impulse towards, like, once they're getting separated, like, what's the impulse driving them to embrace again each other, because light has already slowed down, and therefore some form of it is already broken, and there is a fragmentation of all that omniscience, omnipresence, and as you gave different examples of how in the atom, but then what is this other impulse that is trying to again put them together in an embrace in the material form? Like, is that also another part of light, or is there anything like how in spirituality we would call like the manifestation of the divine or something? So, is there anything like that that you have thought about?
The only thing that I thought about, I want to acknowledge that I think that's a really deep and kind of pretty important question that you bring up. And the way I've thought about it is that the nature of light is one. No matter how it manifests or how it materializes, that essence of it remains what it is, and it shows itself in different aspects as it begins to project itself at slower and slower speeds. But yet there's this innate thing inside it that seeks for its unity, and that we may experience the process as we do with, for example, like the reality of the shadow and the reality of fragmentation. But yet, because the nature is one at its core, there's already this dynamic in place where there's, in a sense, this movement of re-embracing that is will take its process to happen, but that exists simply because no matter how light projects itself, its nature will always remain what it is. So
I think also, if you consider that light's nature is infinite and everything, that downstepping and that slowing down is an exploration of more possibilities. So if you just stay at the all oneness, you're also missing like so many different aspects of experience that, you know, kind of have to be explored to be able to create the oneness and the infinite again. So it's kind of this like cyclical thing where I don't see it as in thinking about time perspective, it's like everything exists all at once, but you have this sort of cycle where everything exists and is all one and everything, but then it also has to create all of that experience and all of the potentials that are possible within
Yeah.
that you know, that structure. And that actually kind of brings up a concept that I've enjoyed, where that at that top level, when thinking about the fundamental particle that that is infinite at that top level, one of the paradigms that I've been introduced to calls it like a particle of consciousness,
Mm.
rather than like, because when we think of a particle of light, we still think of photon, but they call it a particle of consciousness, where then as you downstep, like, and this is kind of like a panpsychist sort of approach expanded, and if you think about it as like an all oneness of consciousness, and then an exploration of all of the different aspects of consciousness, it kind of ties us into it, that we get to experience, you know, our particular portion of that as it builds up into that whole again, that complete consciousness. So I kind of like how it ties into
Yeah.
that methodology, that paradigm.
Thank you. Thank you. Let me just quickly move on to the final musing here. And I think I had saved it. So we've here's the third musing, which is about quanta and the Big Bang. And that's a big topic, and we may have to pick it up also the next time. But here, I can summarize the idea, and then I'll just pause for your comments. But the idea being, first of all, that if we think about quanta, then quanta's, the way I perceive it in a cosmology of light, it's a bridge mechanism that connects one layer of light with a subsequent layer of projected light. Because there is, in a sense, like if we think about light in its native state, there's infinite information there, because we have these properties of omniscience, omnipotence, omnipresence, and omninurturance. And so there's infinite potentiality, infinite information. And then as light projects itself, then some of that information materializes, but it materializes through the device of quanta, which is like a threshold packet or quantity where that information holds itself until it can express itself in some meaningful materialization at the next level. And so quanta is in this point of view, there would be different kinds of quanta. We're familiar with a particular notion of quanta, just as light, begins to travel at 186,000 miles per second. There is something that relates the antecedent layer of light with this layer of light, and that's the notion of quanta that we are kind of honed into. And then in this idea also, the Big Bang becomes a result of this materialization of quanta, because you can imagine, this vast information that's trying to materialize in this layer where light exists at 186,000 miles per second. And as that information materializes, it creates these concrete particles in a sense. And that, to me, is how the Big Bang occurs, because there's a materialization of this subtle information into more material form. And so that manifests as, vast kind of play of particles of the four kinds that we are familiar with, at least. So that's kind of like the summary, but let me pause for your thoughts.
I think this makes a lot of sense. You know, even in something like loop quantum gravity, we use the same reference for quanta, you know, the Planck constant, as we do for something like light packets. So it kind of seems consistent within our perspective of reality. And I could see how sort of at different scales. So in this projection process, I imagine you have sort of different scales of quanta. So like instead of being Planck, it would be, you know,
Yeah.
1/10,000th of Planck, and it creates this sort of um, like this sort of fabric for the growth of crystalline and fractal structures within the fabric of our um, space time or whatever, that could create all sorts of different realities from there. And in a sense, it's almost a better, it's an easier way to visualize what's happening as in those different realities for me,
Great.
in
Yeah.
those different projections.
Yeah. Thanks. So that's you've exactly kind of summarized how I was envisioning it. So thank you. Okay. So I don't know. Do you have any comments before I?
No, I'm like still wrapping my head around this Big Bang and the way how you're linking quanta. It's not really very clear for me, so
Yeah.
I'm just thinking about it. So
Mm.
maybe if you can discuss it a bit more in the next thing,
Sure.
like start with it, and that would be nice.
Yeah, sure. We can do that. So we can use that as a starting point for the next discussion, and just kind of elaborate from there. And but just so that kind of like really grateful that both of you have joined me. I think in this first kind of inaugural session of this series, and I think your backgrounds are so interesting for this initial conversation. So Scott, I didn't realize, but you've um, so you've mentioned quantum loop gravity, and you seem to have a very kind of like a more in-depth knowledge on the physics side and these alternative theories. So that's interesting. And then Dolan coming from the molecular biology, and so this is a really interesting uh, kind of start to this. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't often find any outlets where I can talk about advanced physics concepts and also spiritual concepts at the same time. So this is refreshing.
Okay, awesome. Yeah. Well, I hope
Yeah,
you.
for me too, this is very refreshing because science is as in the world, it's kind of very hardcore. So relating that and embracing both science and spirituality together. And I don't have as much in-depth knowledge like Scott about the different aspects of light and everything, but uh, it's just that basic background. So probably I'm struggling more with this Big Bang thing and also, but it is really nice to have this outlet where there is this concept of scientific things and relating that to spirituality and to the in-depth as we experience reality.
Great. Yeah. Thank you both. And so I'm going to